and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre. This episode of BIC Talks was originally a BIC Streams live recording of the 14th Annual Girish Karnad Memorial Lecture 2021, organized by the New India Foundation in collaboration with Bangalore International Centre. The lecture was delivered by journalist, writer and political commentator Edward Luce. The introduction was by Srinath Raghavan. Manish Sabharwal was in conversation with Edward Luce, and the vote of thanks was given by Neeraja Gopal Jayal. And with that, over to Srinath.
Hello, good evening everyone. I'm Srinath Raghavan, a trustee of the New India Foundation. On behalf of the foundation and my fellow trustees, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Girish Karnad Memorial Lecture. The New India Foundation was set up in 2004 by Nandan Nilekani and Ramachandra Guha. The foundation aims to promote high-quality research and writing on all aspects of independent India. We do this in three ways. The first and most central activity is the NIF Fellowships. These are year-long, handsome fellowships awarded to scholars and writers working on book-length projects pertaining to India after 1947. The NIF Fellows are chosen from a pool of several hundred applicants each round, and the foundation provides them mentorship and editorial support right through to the publication of their books. We've had 51 NIF Fellows to date and 24 books published, with many more in the works. The foundation also awards the Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay NIF Book Prize for the best non-fiction book on modern and contemporary India. The prize for 2020 was awarded jointly to Amit Ahuja and Jairam Ramesh for their outstanding books on contemporary Dalit politics and on V.K. Krishna Menon. The foundation also hosts an annual lecture featuring eminent scholars. This lecture was renamed after the late polymathic scholar and playwright Girish Karnad in 2019. We usually hold this in Bangalore. This year, of course, we are going digital. Our distinguished speaker today is Edward Luce, renowned journalist, writer, and commentator. Very briefly, he is the Financial Times' chief US commentator for the past decade. His long career has included a stint in India, which led to his first and acclaimed book, In Spite of the Gods, The Rise of Modern India in 2007. He has since gone on to write other books. Ed will be talking today about the current moment in American politics and what it portends for America and the world. After Ed's talk, my colleague and managing trustee of NIF, Manish Sabharwal, will engage with him in a conversation, and our colleague and trustee, Professor Neeraja Jayal, will finally wrap it all up. Ed, it would have been lovely to have you in Bangalore, but I'm delighted to welcome you here.
Thank you, Srinath. It's a real honor to be invited to give this Girish Karnad Memorial Lecture. I think I met you and I met Manish in Bangalore at the Literature Festival a couple of years ago. A wonderful experience. The last time I went to India, I guess the pandemic has intervened. And of course, I've known Nandan and Ram for many, many years. Sadly, I didn't know Girish, although I knew him well from a distance. I felt I knew him as this multifarious, secular, creative, artistic, fundamentally benign person who represented the best side of India. So I'm deeply sad that I didn't know him, but very honored to be giving a talk in his name. I've also, by email, got to know, and at the Bangalore Literature Festival, got to know Saraswati Ganapati a little bit in the last couple of years, and it's a delight to have met her. Now, I will get a little bit to India towards the end of this talk, but what I want to focus on, for the most part, is the current moment in American politics. And of course, this is taking place against two very important backdrops. First is that we have a new administration under Joe Biden, a man who repeatedly tells us that America is back. And by that, I think he means that Trump was an aberration and that he's very much the corrective to that aberration. That's not a view I share, but I understand the very salient politics behind this America is back, a phrase that stock phrase of Biden's. But I would sort of take the warning from history, from Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, which is you cannot step into the same river twice. The river that Biden got out of in 2016 as vice president to the outgoing Obama administration is a very different river to the one that he stepped back into. Trump has roiled the waters, if you like. The second context to this talk is the emerging consensus that America and China are in a new Cold War, that they're very much destined to be the grand geopolitical rivals which will dominate global geopolitics for the coming decades. Again, I'd sort of refer to an ancient Greek philosopher, though I promise this will exhaust my stock of ancient Greek philosophy, namely Thucydides, who talked about the inevitable clash between the existing hegemon, America, and a declining one, and the rising one, Sparta or China. And I think that's sort of Thucydidean trap, as it's called, is a consensus into which Biden has walked in Washington, D.C. as president. And it's a very important piece of the furniture that wasn't there when he was last in the White House. So let me talk a little bit about US democracy and its health. I live just a few miles from Capitol Hill, where a couple of months ago, as you know, there was this unprecedented assault on this sacred citadel of democracy by thousands of people, some of whom had nooses, some of whom were waving Confederate flags, some of whom had handcuffs, who were shouting things like "Hang Pence, hang Pelosi" after the Democratic Speaker of the House. Now, fortunately, they didn't reach any of their political targets. There were some very close calls, but nobody was hanged. I have no doubt, though, if they'd come across Mike Pence or any of the other people that they believed were part of an elaborate deep state plot to rob Donald Trump of the election, that there would have been violence, and that the notorious, already deeply infamous events of January the 6th would have been dramatically worse. Donald Trump is now living in Mar-a-Lago, and I'll get onto him a little bit later. But he, I think we should remember, lost the election, but he lost it with 74 million votes, which is the second highest tally of any president in American history. Biden, of course, got 81 million votes, and he won, but he is the highest tally, therefore, of any American president in history. But that 74 million, those 74 million Americans who voted for Trump are not going anywhere. They are very much with Donald Trump in believing that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. Now, I've spent a large chunk of my adult life living in the United States, and I've watched the steep decline of public faith in the democratic system here and in public institutions. There's a sort of collapse of faith. You can make an analogy with a retreat into atheism and nihilism amongst large chunks of the American population, a loss of faith in the American creed, which is meritocracy, which is equality of opportunity. Now, Joe Biden has a brief window, and I stress the word brief, to try and redress this loss of faith, whether we call it atheism or nihilism, this collapse of belief in the American promise. He has a brief window, a reprieve, if you like, and it's a very important moment, therefore, that I'm giving this talk to you, 7 weeks in to this new presidency. The "America is back" stock phrase that he uses means a lot in Biden's vocabulary. But let me put the best possible gloss on it. I think there are some people, perhaps in India, certainly in Europe, who worry a little bit about what that means, because the America that existed before Trump wasn't necessarily good for many other parts of the world. We remember wars of choice. We remember the global war on terror. We remember the great financial crash of 2008, it's not as if Trump is the beginning of America's problems. Trump, in my view, is very much a natural outcome to these trends that I talked about that have lasted decades. The best possible gloss to put on America is back is that it will promote a value-based foreign policy. Biden will promote democracy, very strongly in favor, unlike Trump, but also unlike Obama, of pushing the democracy agenda globally, but not in favor of wars of choice, not in favor of Iraq or Vietnam style coercive democratic ventures, if you like. So neither transactionalist, neither amoral like Trump was, nor is he embracing a messianic freedom agenda like George W. Bush, not neoconservative, not isolationist. And he's also aware that the most important way he can promote democracy is to repair it at home in the United States. That is the single best thing that he can do to showcase that it's alive and kicking. So how's he doing so far in the first 7 weeks? Well, I've covered several American presidents and I've studied many more. And I think it's fair to say that this first couple of months is the most accident-free, the smoothest opening to a presidency that I can remember. Trump administration doesn't need underlining. It was a sort of rolling chaos. But if you look to Obama, the Tea Party emerged very soon, within a few weeks of him becoming president, and put pretty much a stop to his domestic agenda after a couple of years. If you look to George W. Bush, he passed a very unpopular tax cut in his opening months, unpopular even within his own administration. And then, of course, he hit the buffer of 9/11, which changed everything. If you look at Bill Clinton, he got into this very early row about gays in the military and then launched this healthcare reform led by his wife, Hillary Clinton, known as Hillary Care, which, of course, came to a very ignominious end, and so on. If you look back at the opening stages of most presidencies, they are usually very accident prone, and this one isn't. And I think it's worth stressing that Biden is a very experienced figure. A lot of us have focused on his age, which is 78, which is, of course, by far the oldest in American history to take office in the White House. But we've stressed his experience a bit less, which is the positive way of looking at his age. Obama had spent 2 years in Washington as a senator. Bush had never served in Washington. Clinton had never served in Washington. George Bush Sr. had, Reagan never had, Carter never had, and so on. It's extremely unusual to get a president like Biden with 36 years in Washington as a senator and 8 years in Washington as vice president. I think it's safe to say that Biden is the most experienced president, incoming president in American history, perhaps with the exception of Thomas Jefferson. But I can't really think of any other. And that counts for something. It's not a feature of his resume that he advertised during the election, because you tend to run against Washington in America. Politics, at least federal politics in America, is, I think, the only business I know of where experience counts against you. So Biden didn't advertise this feature, but it's an extremely important part of his makeup as a politician. He's seen this movie 100 times before. He knows where you slip up. And he's appointed people who, for the most part, I'm thinking of Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary, or Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, for the most part, who are also very experienced. So that's one feature to his first 7 weeks. The second quality that I think is really worth emphasizing is the quality that Bonaparte Napoleon said was the most important one in his generals, namely luck. Biden has been fairly lucky. He came into office after really at the peak of the pandemic, at the peak of coronavirus death rates. The worst 3 months were November, December, January, just as that peak was starting to plateau, firstly. And secondly, of course, just as the vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and others, were starting to come online. And he's fulfilling what I consider, and in my modest way in my career, have tried to follow the most important rule of jobs, which is always follow an underperformer. Donald Trump, as you might recall, promised endlessly to find magical solutions to this pandemic, to the coronavirus. Biden promised 100 million jabs, 100 million vaccine shots within the first 100 days. Now, he's already achieved that in less than 50 days. So by under-promising and over-delivering, he is really proving himself to be the mirror image of Donald Trump. And so I think we have the very realistic prospect of the United States achieving herd immunity, with every adult who wants to get injected being vaccinated by late May, early June, which, of course, is a very powerful springboard for a strong economic recovery. Which brings me on to the economy. Last night, Biden gave his first Oval Office address to the nation, having signed a $1.9 trillion pandemic relief bill, a stimulus basically, which if you combine with a $900 billion bill that was passed in the lame duck Congress in December and a $2.3 trillion bill passed last April, amounts to 25% of GDP in pandemic relief, 25% of GDP over and above the normal budget. Nothing like this has been seen since the Second World War in terms of deficit spending and addition to the national debt. So when America says it is treating COVID-19 as a war, well, the fiscal response tends to back that up. This is an extraordinary shift in American politics because of the pandemic. As you know, the Chinese character for crisis can also mean opportunity. Well, the left has turned this crisis in America into an opportunity. In 1993, Bill Clinton very famously said, the era of big government is over. Well, Biden, I think, is all but saying the era of big government is back, and we should not underestimate the importance of this shift. It is happening. So what could possibly go wrong? I've just described to you almost the ideal opening to a presidency, one that is very hard to find a parallel with in recent decades, and a likelihood that the remainder, or most of the remainder of Biden's first year, it could look even better if herd immunity plus economic rebound comes, as I expect both will. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, plenty will go wrong. Stuff just always does go wrong. Let me highlight the two most important dangers in my view, but they're by no means exhaustive. The first is a domestic one. The second is a foreign one. Let me start with the domestic one. I mentioned Donald Trump earlier on in Retreat at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. Trump is continuing to allege that this election was rigged and stolen, and upwards of 70% of his 74 million voters agree with him. His party, for the most part, agrees with him. When he was impeached for the second time following the January 6th storming of the Capitol Hill, what I like to think of as America's Munich beer hall putsch after early Hitler activity, very, very few Republicans voted to impeach him, and still fewer voted to convict him. The same as first time round when he was impeached in early 2020. The party is with him. One of the few people who voted to convict him, to impeach him, was Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, who Trump is now spending a lot of energy and capital because he has a very big war chest trying to unseat from her district. In other words, and this is, I think, a measure of where the Republican Party is, the Cheney family is the moderate wing. Think of it like that. Now, if in a two-party democracy, one party essentially rejects democratic norms, the legitimacy of democratic outcomes, you do not have a stable democracy. They, at the moment, do not have control of the House, and the Senate split 50-50 with Kamala Harris, the vice president, as a deciding vote. So it's just narrowly in favor of Biden. But the judiciary is very much on the conservative side. I think Trump's most enduring legacy was changing the character of the judiciary. The Supreme Court is now 6-3 conservative with Trump, and very strongly supportive when cases have come to it of attempts to basically reduce the electorate, make it more difficult to vote, and to side with the suppress the vote sort of tendency in the Republican Party. Since January, more than 400 bills have been filed across the 50 states in legislatures controlled by Republicans to reduce the size of the electorate, to enhance state legislatures' ability to gerrymander the district boundaries, to sort of shape them into ever more pretzel-like shapes that pack minority votes into one district and therefore make the other districts more likely to be Republican. The Republican Party is Trump's party. And if you look at opinion polls amongst Republican voters who they wish to be the presidential nominee in 2024, Donald Trump comes way to the top. There's no one else is anywhere close to him. He gets more than half. The next highest, I believe, is Mike Pence, the former vice president, with 8%. And then third is Donald Trump Jr. And to Indian ears, that dynastic sort of flavor will ring familiar. So the populist explosion is not dead in America. It's waiting in the wings for Biden to slip up. And I think that in all the sort of well-deserved plaudits for the basic minimum competence that Biden has shown so far is something that we should not forget. The populist moment in American politics is by no means over. The second threat to Biden is a little bit more subtle, but no less real because of it. And that's on the foreign side, and that is a misplaying of the US-China relationship. Now, Biden, as I mentioned, has democratic values at the core of his foreign policy. The America is back means America as a democracy promoter is back. And that's potentially a very complicating element to his foreign policy, which is chiefly making sure that China does not ride roughshod over global rules and does not continue unchecked in its rather pugilistic rise as a great global power, holding other countries, allies, partners to high democratic values will complicate that. And I think India is a very good example. America doesn't have a very good record of democracy promotion. If you think of the tiny island of Cuba, 90 miles off America's coast, for decades, America has been trying to democratize Cuba through various methods without any success. If you think of Afghanistan, 20 years into this war, where some of the American troops in Afghanistan today were not born when it began, $3 trillion worth of spending. And Ashraf Ghani, its president today, has no more legitimacy in the eyes or control in the eyes of the Afghan people than Hamid Karzai did on day one. I think it's worth stressing that, Vietnam, which is critical to any ad hoc series of relationships America will be seeking to deepen to counter China's worst instincts. Pakistan, none of these countries are susceptible to being told whether to democratize or not. So Biden's going to have to either say it's an empty talking point or it's going to become a problem. And of course, it would become a particular problem in the relationship with India. Fortunately, I haven't been asked to talk about Narendra Modi today because I mostly wouldn't have very good things to say about him. But I think it's worth stressing that whatever problems India is having with its democracy, and whatever truth there is to the claim that America is becoming an illiberal democracy and suffering from an undeclared emergency and so forth, and watching secularism decay, this is a problem for Indians to solve. This is not a problem that can be solved in the think tanks of Washington. And I think and hope that the Biden administration will understand that point. I'm pretty sure they will ultimately understand it, and therefore can fairly confidently predict that even if Modi, as I fear, continues in an illiberal direction, it will make very little difference to the fact that the United States needs India as a counterbalance to China and will continue to seek its partnership. I did briefly flick through Jaishankar's book, The Indian Way, and so I understand very clearly that India does not want to become a treaty partner of the United States. And I think that's sensible, that India in some ways will remain technically non-aligned, even as it de facto cooperates more closely with groups like the Quad group of Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. In fact, there's a Quad meeting going on today that Modi and Biden are participating in. So I think that point is probably well understood, but there is a larger impetus in American politics to create binary choices in foreign politics. To some extent, there's a sort of pre-existing condition there to see the world in Manichaean form. And we have heard talk from people in this new administration of there being a global conflict, a struggle between autocracy and democracy. So not just a new Cold War on the geopolitical plane between the United States and China, but an ideological Cold War, much like the original Cold War. And I think that's a worrying tendency. It's always sort of latent in the American approach to foreign policy. I was talking to, before this began, I was talking a little bit to Ravi and Srinath about a book I'm researching on Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the foreign policy advisor to Jimmy Carter, and he was very much up there with Henry Kissinger as amongst the grand strategists of American foreign policy. And I had quite a long Zoom with Kissinger yesterday, age 98, as sharp as a tack, writing 2 books. And we got into this subject. And he said something very interesting. Both of these figures, Kissinger and Brzezinski, are, in his view, and I share it, not only the 2 most impactful national security advisors America's had in foreign policy strategists, but no coincidence, were born and raised abroad. They have, in his words, the tragedy of possibilities in their head. And Americans often don't have the tragedy of possibilities in their head. So if there is a deep concern about Biden, it is this pressure that will be on him to create a black and white Manichaean foreign policy that sees the struggle with China not as something manageable and messy and ad hoc, but as something far greater and more titanic than that. And I can't be confident that Biden will be able to resist that narrative. Now, 4 years ago, when Trump came in, I wrote a book called The Retreat of Western Liberalism about the reversals being suffered across the Western world, including my own country, Britain, the United States, elsewhere, to try and explain why. And my publishers tried to get me to change the title from The Retreat of Western Liberalism to The Collapse of Western Liberalism. And I resisted and I retained Retreat. And I'm very glad I did, because sitting here talking to you about the first 7 weeks of Biden at the end, well, not at the end, but 1 year into a global pandemic, is a reminder that nothing is predictable. I would not have imagined that if you told me 18 months ago that America would spend 25% of its GDP, mostly skewed towards the poorer, a highly necessary fiscal corrective, I would not have found that a remotely feasible scenario. American exceptionalism is something, and I think you have Indian exceptionalism too, is something that Kissinger in his talk with me worried about. American exceptionalism is what helped breed the complacency that led to the rise of Trump. When you have a sort of cultural self-adulation, like exceptionalism does, and the British suffer from their own version of it, you tend to stop thinking realistically. You tend to stop thinking practically. And I think if the recent history of the United States, and indeed of India, teaches us anything, is that it's never over. You know, Benjamin Franklin famously said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Well, it's never over. The battle for a just and fair society is never won. It keeps having to be refought again and again. Well, what we find today is a brief window with, I think, a very decent man as American president. And again, you know, I can't believe I'm using those words. We have a decent man as American president. We have a brief window in which some of these gross distempers in American society and in American democracy might be redressed. I very much hope they will be. And I very much look forward also to hearing from you what you think about this.
Thank you, Ed. That was spectacular. Absolutely. So even when you sort of wrote Retreat of Western Liberalism, when I read it, it felt like you were saying that Trump is not a passing shower. There is climate change here, right? And why do you think that? Is this race and religion, or is this economics and inequality?
I think it's both. I mean, there's been this rather theological debate amongst scholars and journalists that either this is the root of this is racism, or the root of this is economic stagnation, the hollowing out of the middle class. I don't think that these are separable. I think that the sort of waning of optimism about the American dream, the stagnation of incomes, the decline in life expectancy, which is not something that happens during peacetime normally, that you've now seen for 3 consecutive years before the pandemic, creates the ripe conditions for people to harvest, politicians to harvest resentment for their own electoral ends. And so I think that, you know, this is neither economic anxiety alone or what is euphemistically called cultural anxiety about multiracial, multi-ethnic, the emerging demographic majority, as they call it. It's both. People are happy to tolerate differences when they feel it isn't a zero-sum game. When it becomes a zero-sum game, then the whole climate changes. And Trump, of course, was a sort of Olympic medalist at finding that resentment and coining votes out of it.
So is there something going on in the economy which is making people feel it's a zero-sum game, or is this just technologies, the march of technology is reducing jobs and employment, or is there something in the American economy which has changed from the 60s, 70s or 50s, or whenever people didn't view the economy as a zero-sum game?
Yes, there's largely the impact of technology. Again, people talk about technology and globalization as if they're different things, but they're essentially the same thing. You talk about technology-enabled globalization. It's technology that enables offshoring, outsourcing, and so forth. And why I think America and Britain have been hit worse by populism than democracies like Germany is that the support of the public sector, whether it be a local or national, the safety net, the rainy day assistance to people to help transition to the new economy in terms of being educated and in terms of having the funds to carry them over in that transition, has been decimated, the US and the UK, to a far greater extent than most other Western democracies are, and not all. I also think that, the Cold War, we were talking about a Cold War earlier, the Soviet Union claimed to be a workers' paradise. That kept the West honest. They needed to show that workers do better in the West, that they are more prosperous than they were in the Soviet bloc, and they did. But then the Cold War ended, and that whole sort of pressure disappeared. So I think it's no accident that the high noon of neoliberalism occurs really after the end of the Cold War.
So do you think this economic anxiety shows up in economic policy, or how does it show up in economic policy in the US? Is it just in just more debt or this kind, or does it show up in other ways?
Well, if you're talking about recent economic policy, this extraordinary 1.9 trillion stimulus, it's targeted. There are checks going to everybody, basically. Everybody, other than the sort of top 10, 15%, is getting a $1,400 check. People with children are getting several $100 checks per child. The unemployment benefit is being extended. State and local governments are getting several $100 billion not to fire, health workers and police, etc. So these are all very middle class sort of assistance measures. And it's wildly popular. I mean, this is popular with Republicans. Shouldn't forget that Trump ran as a very different kind of Republican. He didn't run as a Reagan Republican. He ran saying, I will protect your Social Security. I will build infrastructure. And it was plausible because, the guy puts his name on buildings. Infrastructure sounded plausible. He didn't do any of this. So there was kind of a bait and switch, what my colleague Martin Wolf calls Pluto-populism. You culturally make people feel like you're on their side whilst basically picking their pockets. And Trump was the apotheosis of Pluto-populism. He didn't deliver the kinds of things that the American middle class, white, not white, racist, not racist, all want, which is more support.
So if economic sort of anxiety is sort of, it gets a larger social security system and an expansion of the big government, how will cultural anxiety show up in policy? Or will Democrats ignore, they don't need to deal with cultural anxiety? Or could you guess on how cultural anxiety could be addressed by Democrats? Will they turn on immigration? Will they turn in other ways? Will they have to respond to the 74 million voters of Trump?
I think that if Biden's luck, Napoleonic luck, continues, and we do get a strong rebound, then I think some of that will be drained. There's never going to be a way of defeating a sort of hardcore 15, 20% of Americans who I think are just basically opposed to multicultural society and fear a multi-ethnic America. There is racism there that probably can't be defeated. But the fellow travelers who helped give Trump a majority, yeah, they can be picked off. There were millions of people who voted for Obama, who voted for Trump, who switched. Now, maybe they were racist when they voted for Obama, but his skin color didn't matter so much that they didn't vote for Obama. So, the idea that America is post-racial, which I, remember very well people saying in the wake of Obama's victory, that now we can forget our history, that it's over. That was clearly a little bit too Panglossian. That wasn't merited. I have one fear here, which is that the politics of critical race theory is going to provoke a white lash, if you like. There is this sense that whites are sort of ancestrally responsible for slavery, and there's nothing they can really do to absolve themselves of that responsibility, which is, you can get into, well, which whites are you talking? Are you talking about descendants of people in the South? You're talking about descendants of Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants? What do they have to do with, once you get into the only essential thing about you is your color and you're white, then I don't think you're getting into a good place there. And there is part of the left that is a very culturally woke, very, very awakened, critical race theory left is what I think of it as. And I don't think that ends in a good place. If you have a disagreement over the size of government, you can split the difference. It's a question of mathematics. If you have a disagreement over biology, There's not too many sort of compromises there. You can't really split differences.
So there's a question from Professor Jairam. How would Biden deal with racism?
Well, America desperately needs criminal justice reform. The degree to which the system targets African Americans in particular. I mean, I think we're used to talking about it as being whites versus everyone else. To a large extent, it's African Americans and everyone else. I don't think Indian Americans and Japanese Americans particularly discriminated against. There's not much of a legacy there. The real issue here is African Americans. And the penal system is a deeply biased system. Policing, as we've seen, deeply biased. Voter suppression, deeply targeted at African Americans. So there's all kinds of things he can do. And I think he's already sort of beginning to do through the Department of Justice to attempt to redress these issues, which are deeply important ones. They need to be tackled. But, as I hate to go back, I'm not a Marxist, but economics is important. And giving people, when Procter & Gamble or some Fortune 500 company says we've got a diversity policy and, we're going to have X, Y, and Z, in our upper echelons of management, great. But also pay the janitors a minimum wage of $15 an hour. If you actually mean what you say about diversity, you need to think about socioeconomic diversity. You need to pay people proper wages. And I think you'll find that most African Americans would like that $15 an hour minimum wage, just like most whites who don't get it would like it. They can be united on this point.
So there are a bunch of questions. You've answered the criminal justice question, which Kirit had, but there are a bunch of questions on China and Nirupama Rao. Will the Biden policy be a continuation of the Trump policy, or will it be competition tempered by a dose of cooperation? And just a connected question is, would the impactful strategist Henry Kissinger have acted differently if he could have predicted the rise of China to the extent that was impacted by his actions? I remember Warren Buffett once said that if airline investors were around, then they should have shot down the Wright brothers when they flew. I've heard an American worker say that we should have shot down Kissinger's plane when they went to China. So if we hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have reached where we are. But would love to get your take on that.
It's a very good question. The diagnosis of the Biden people is not that much different than Trump's diagnosis. There is a consensus in Washington, D.C. that China is a challenger power, that Thucydides' trap is basically what we're in, the existing hegemon, the rising hegemon. And I think that's a consensus. Where they will and already are radically differing is in tactics. Biden is a highly predictable person. He has a team of highly predictable foreign policy specialists, Jake Sullivan, whom I know, Tony Blinken, plenty of others who will signal and telegraph what the administration is doing well in advance. There's not going to be diplomacy by tweet. You're not going to suddenly wake up and find that, your aluminium and steel exports have a 20% tariff, or that America's demanding you double your soybean imports, or that all Chinese tech companies are overnight banned from the United States. It's going to be a much more calibrated, telegraphed foreign policy, but very, very little different in strategic aim to what Trump wished to do. I think the biggest tactical difference is that Biden wants to work with allies and partners, and Trump had contempt for allies and partners. It was a very self-defeating way of approaching diplomacy. Biden understands that America is powerful when it acts collectively, and that China has only one ally, North Korea, and America has dozens. And so I think repairing alliances is probably the most important distinction, in addition to the temperamental sort of character difference with Trump. Should Kissinger's plane have been shot down en route to Beijing, the Sino-Soviet split and America's exploitation of it was, in chessboard sort of terms, probably the grandest move of the American Cold War. It's, I think, what ultimately did for the Soviet Union. You could argue that its own sclerosis, its own sort of gerontocratic stagnation was the prime cause of the Soviet Union's collapse. I certainly wouldn't downplay the shift of China into the American camp. It's been a beneficiary of the Pax Americana, the global system, joining the WTO. And America has increasingly, in the last 15 to 20 years, come to see China as the scapegoat, as well as the culprit for the hollowing out of industrial America. I have to say, I don't think that's correct. I think China has fewer manufacturing jobs today than it did 5 years ago. America has fewer manufacturing jobs, but it produces more. So we're not really in a manufacturing crisis, we're in a manufacturing employment crisis. This is about automation. And it's therefore about the failure of the United States to equip its workforce for the needs of today's labor market, and to provide the kind of social safety net that I talked about earlier. It's interesting that countries with good social safety nets like Germany are not scapegoating China for everything, because there is a certain degree of social peace in the labor force.
So there are a bunch of questions about foreign policy. Let me just bunch three of them together. Vijay asks, in your talk, Russia doesn't figure, has it become irrelevant? Rohini Nilikini asks, how long will it take to restore the trust of Europe in the US, and can President Biden even manage this? And Buddha Bagai says that, basically thanks to the control of the Pakistani army, India has suffered and US has perhaps unwittingly diluted democracy in Pakistan. How do you think the policy towards Pakistan will be for Biden?
I'll start with Russia. You're right, I didn't mention Russia. It's interesting. There are some people, having referred to Kissinger and Brzezinski earlier, there are some people who want to see a reverse Kissinger, a reverse Brzezinski, in other words, to break off Russia from its close relationship with China, and not to pay too much attention to Putin's human rights violations, etc., in order to incentivize him to look more west and less east. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think the values element to Biden is too important. But Russia, we should not forget, is a fraction the size of China economically. It's about the same size as the Italian economy, which is not insignificant, but it's not one of the global big players any longer, except in energy. So the threat posed by Russia is very much to do with its geopolitical ambitions, which leads me on to the Europe question. The Europeans are not clamoring to join a US-led global democracy revival movement. Europeans are split on this question. Of course, you have some European countries like Poland and Hungary that are very much populist. Viktor Orban is, the man who coined the phrase illiberal democracy. You have others like Germany that, export 4 times as many Volkswagens to China as they do to the United States, that have a mercantilist incentive in not having too binary a world. Britain has left the European Union, so that voice within the EU to shape it in a more Atlanticist direction has gone. And Emmanuel Macron, France's president, is talking about creating European strategic autonomy, meaning less dependent on the United States. Meanwhile, this Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia is nearing completion. Merkel is no more susceptible to Biden's charms on that issue than she was to Trump's. So there is a real politique here that makes it quite hard for America to actually be back. I quoted that Heraclitus earlier, you don't step into the same river twice. This is a different river. So I think inevitably any cooperation that we're going to see, and this in American eyes will hopefully include India. I'm skeptical, but it will hopefully has to be on technology. It has to be on the technology systems we have on the internet regulations we have, on 5G, on AI, on robotics. That's where the real game is. And that, I guess, is something the Biden administration is more and more going to try to get both transatlantic and Indo-Pacific cooperation on.
The Pakistan question?
Oh, Pakistan. Well, it's hard to answer the Pakistan question without looking at this looming deadline of May the 1st for the United States to withdraw its remaining 2,500 troops. I don't think America is going to withdraw its remaining 2,500 troops because it's not very many troops for arguably quite a lot of protection for the Afghan government from the Taliban. And I think the sort of potential images of the Taliban regaining control of Kabul are too visceral for Biden to take that risk. Therefore, we're going to have a continuation of this very, very uneasy, completely insoluble US-Pakistan relationship in which they pretend to be helping, but with the other hand are doing the opposite. And I'm trying to imagine the day when Pakistan doesn't do that, and it would be a day where the military isn't the predominant institution. How we get from here to that day is higher than my pay grade.
P.R. Krishnakutty asked a sort of related question that Biden and Kamala were vocal about the situation in Kashmir and the Citizen Amendment Act during the election campaign. I think you answered this question, but she asked, do you think those concerns will be aired or will they swept under the rug as Washington looks to India to counter China?
I think that a lot depends on whether the Citizens Amendment Bill law and related the National Registry. If these things are sort of revived after whatever the farmers' protest demonstrations, recede and Modi's sort of back in master of his agenda, if he does sort of revive these with a vengeance, it's going to create a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to criticize India. Ditto with Kashmir. So, there's always going to be that tendency. And I think it's usually there more with Democratic administrations from the Indian point of view than Republicans, that Americans tend to preach and Indians don't like it. I have to say, I think that Modi deserves all the criticism coming his way from everybody, but it's probably counterproductive coming from an American administration. And I think the Biden people will probably learn to understand this if they don't already.
So there are a lot of questions on politics, but we'll come back to that, back to US politics. But Nandan Nilekani is asking, what do the appointments of Lina Khan to the FTC, Tim Wu to the NEC, and Vanita Gupta as Associate General, and Rohit Chopra as the head of CFPB signify? They are all Warren progressives. Will this mean more focus on big tech and big business?
Yeah, they're not just all Warren progressives, they're all Asian Americans, and 3 out of 4 of them are South Asian Americans. Well, actually, I think Indian Americans. These are, as you point out, Nandan, people who've given a lot of thought to antitrust action on big tech. And they do tend to be on the Warren wing of the party. You're quite right to mention that. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, talks of foreign policy for the middle class. Now, what this means is ultimately industrial policy. Industrial policy is something that we haven't really heard since the days of Eisenhower and Kennedy, the days that sort of through DARPA, the ARPANET gave us so many of the innovations that undergird Silicon Valley. And I think there is a strong view within the Biden administration that industrial policy must be combined with proper regulation of big tech. The fact that you have so much concentration in the American economy is, I think, seen as not unrelated to the declining bargaining power of labor. And it's the declining bargaining power of labor that has created such populism, particularly in foreign policy. So Where they, in practical terms, end up, I don't know. Are we going to get Facebook forced to divest WhatsApp and Instagram? Would that really make any difference if they were? I think these kinds of debates are being had. Should European-style privacy laws be imported? Should people be paid for the data that they provide to companies? Should we have German-style regulation of speech on social media, because we really can't, leave it up to Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg to decide whether a president is on their platform or not? It's such an important part of speech. All of these questions I know are in ferment, but the one I would point you to as the most important is there is a desire for industrial policy. And it's been a toxic term, industrial policy, for 40 or more years in the United States. Now it's back in fashion.
So I'll try and bunch of questions about US politics. I think they want to go back that people are puzzled by the bipolar nature of political parties in the US. It's almost like they're two different worldviews. So, how will this get resolved? How can American politics ever transform? And why did, if you were given a time machine and could go back in time, which year would you go back to partly correct the mistakes which have led to what happens in American politics today? So it's people sort of worried about, will it ever heal itself, and where did this start?
I would probably sort of leapfrog across a number of years, but if I had to choose one in terms of the tone of American politics, I would probably go back to 1994 and ensure that whatever plane Newt Gingrich was flying into DC on didn't crash. I do not wish to see people burning in flames, but that it was diverted to Alaska or somewhere, or Cuba, actually. Yes, Havana. I would divert Newt Gingrich's flight to Havana, because Gingrich, as speaker, halfway through Clinton's first term, changed the nature of American politics. He made bipartisan action impossible. And the American system is predicated on the idea that you have loose and continually shifting coalitions, that no faction becomes crystallized. It's not a parliamentary system with parliamentary voting discipline. That works in a Westminster system. Gingrich changed all that. And he turned the Republicans into a party that essentially wanted to create a defeat with every bill. So Obama pushes through healthcare reform based on the healthcare reform Mitt Romney pushed through as Republican governor of Massachusetts, which itself was based on the Heritage Foundation, the conservative foundation, very conservative plan, free market-based healthcare reform. Obama, being a moderate centrist, chooses the free market plan. They declare, the Republicans, in Gingrich style, that they will turn this into his Waterloo, that they will defeat Obama, because that's the game, to defeat Obama. That's not how American politics used to work. And so that sort of change, that polarization, is something I would date back to Newt Gingrich. But you can pick, a lot of characters. You could pick Rupert Murdoch, who sort of softened up the culture for Gingrichism to succeed. You could pick Rush Limbaugh, the conservative talk radio guy who just died a few weeks ago. You could pick a lot of forerunners to Donald Trump that created the conditions for Donald Trump to succeed. But I think the basic point is that people didn't suddenly just become cynical about politics in America. It took decades to get to this point.
So I guess Ramji asked a related question. Did the checks and balances work to check Trump's successes, or they weren't sufficient? And then Saras Ganapati asks, can Biden's decency prevail against the Republican Senate that votes as a bloc, evangelicals, petroleum industry, etc.?
Let me take Saras's first. This 50+1 is actually quite convenient for Biden. because otherwise, the left would have a lot more sway. If it was 61 that they had in the Senate and a majority of 40 or 50 in the House, as opposed to 15 or 12 or 15, then the left would have much, much more sway. And Biden's real battle would be with the left. Right now, he can use the fact that they've only got 50 votes in the Senate as discipline to say, look, it's this or nothing, and get through the kinds of, by his standards, centrist bills that he wants to get through. I think, though, that probably we've seen the penultimate one, if not the last one, with this COVID relief bill. He's got immigration reform. There's going to be several moderate, inverted commas, moderate Democrats who will oppose it for not being draconian enough on the border wall, not being Trumpian enough. He has got a Restore Democracy bill and the John Lewis voting rights bill, which would outlaw gerrymandering, which would enable people to register to vote on the same day. It would automatically register people, I think. All kinds of really important reforms that the Republicans will fight tooth and nail, but they'll get some Democrats with them. So the way I see it, there's two parties right now. There's the Democratic Party and there's Joe Manchin. And Joe Manchin is this Democratic senator, centrist senator from West Virginia, who is having the time of his life. Basically, he can direct all the pork, in America to West Virginia as the price for voting for any of these bills. The ultimate debate is going to come down to whether to abolish the filibuster, which appears nowhere in America's Constitution. It was developed really during the mid-19th century by Southern senators as a way of killing legislation that would reduce the rights of slave states. It was then revived to oppose civil rights legislation in the 50s and 60s. And I think it would be a brilliant way of heralding a new era in American politics to say, we are going to abolish the filibuster so that we can give statehood to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico and the American Virgin Islands. We are going to abolish essentially a Jim Crow device that is nowhere in the Constitution in order to expand the franchise to those states in America that aren't yet recognized as states that also happen to be non-white. That would be crossing a nuclear threshold, though. And again, this is a debate. This is something Biden, as a traditionalist, is going to have to be forced to do. But I've no doubt that there is going to be growing pressure on him to do this as you see one after other of these bills die in the Senate.
So is there talk of election reform? Is there talk of, counting faster? Is there talk of not being so decentralized, like a sort of election commission reform, this whole debate of popular vote versus electoral college? Do you think there's going to be some election reform other than your outlining, you said outlawing gerrymandering and sort of voter registration, but just the process is so decentralized, or that decentralization is so core to America's identity that we will always have these distributed and multiple counting and that gives the basis for people to say that the election was stolen, or not really?
Let's just sort of indulge a thought experiment that these two bills I mentioned, the John Lewis Voting Act and the Protecting American Democracy Act, I think it's called that. Let's say these two bills were passed and signed into law. I don't think there's any chance of that happening. They would then be appealed and they would go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would, I promise you, strike them down. They would not actually be put into effect, because the Supreme Court would say, under the Constitution, it's states that determine how they vote and how their electors are elected. It's not the federal government. And so, there are going to be federal attempts to change these things, but the only ones that are going to get past this Supreme Court, which is originalist, that's the name of its judicial philosophy, the only ones that will get past them are amendments to the Constitution. You'd have to amend the Constitution, basically, And to amend the Constitution, you need 2/3 of each chamber, plus 3/4 of America's states to ratify. Those states, think of South Dakota, like 400,000 people, 2 senators. Whereas California, 40 million people, 2 senators. Now you can imagine small states really love the system, and there are more small states than large states. This would be like turkeys voting for Christmas. They're not going to vote for it. They're going to. So my concern, my longer term concern with America is this minority veto over democracy gets more and more acute as time goes on. The judicial branch is really, for the next 20 years, in the hands of originalists who are going to be a backstop to any democratic attempts to change that system. And then the ultimate way of changing it, the only real way of changing it, which is by constitutional amendment, is impossible. So my concern is the demographic majority are going to get extremely frustrated as they find themselves blocked again and again. It's very hard to see a way out of it.
So what are the chances, this is a high-low question, what are the chances of Donald Trump being the Republican candidate for the president in 24?
That's impossible to answer. I mean, he wants people to think he's going to be. Whether that means he will, I don't know. But he wants to monetize, his name. And being kicked off Twitter and Facebook makes it much harder for him to monetize his name. His clubs are doing very badly. The golf clubs are all losing money. His property business is being picked apart by federal and New York investigators. So to sort of go back to a question earlier that I skipped accidentally, the system to a large degree is working. The legal system, the wheels move slow. But there are sort of parallel criminal investigations into into allegations of tax fraud, bank fraud, and other financial crimes that are going to tie him up in knots and his organization up in knots for years to come in an organization that's losing money and that owes a lot of money. And no bank will touch him. In the decade before he became president, only one bank would touch him. That was Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank said now they're not going to touch him. So I don't know if there's some, Russian SPACs or something that can, extend him a loan. But basically, he's desperate for money. And the way to monetize is to be in the public eye. And the way to be in the public eye is to be thought of as the nominee in 2024. Whether that actually means he will be is a whole nother question. But it ought to be stressed. Most of his children and one of his daughter-in-laws are planning to run for office. Ivanka wants to run. Lara Trump, who's his daughter-in-law, wants to run. Donald Trump Jr., God forbid, wants to run. There are a lot of Trumps looking to monetize the Trump name.
So we're running out of time here, but I wanted to zoom out on a question which said whether you agree the world is relapsing into sort of the mode it found itself in 1945. This is from Ravi Rajgopalan, which is a bipolar world where you're diametrically opposed to each other politically, economically, and ideologically. But the difference this time is that economic interlinkages are much higher between US and China than the US. So will you say that the Biden administration will talk less about democracy and consolidate frontiers, and this has important implications for sort of India?
I think he's going to talk quite a bit about democracy, but I don't think it's going to be, with a neoconservative undertone. I don't think that the idea of democracy, being delivered by tanks or drones, whatever, is. I think that's anathema to these people. These are experienced, decent people. Some of them were on the wrong side in the Iraq War, by which I mean they supported it. But I think have probably learned what a catastrophic mistake the Iraq War was for the United States and for the world. So I think Biden he's going to be very good at what I call the constant gardening of diplomacy. Very difficult, by the way, in Zoom times. You really do need to meet people to get proper diplomacy done. But that'll come. I think he's going to have to sort of hold contradictory thoughts in his head at the same time, about confronting China and cooperating with China. I think that's the path he would like to plow. And I think that, like any president, events, how he responds to events, which can't be predicted, will define what he's like. So right now, I'm just giving you the sort of outlines, but we will see him when he responds to events. Let's hope that they're not events up in the Himalayas or in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, and that they're more about trade, technology, intellectual property protection, which, where deals can be done. And just as a sort of final point, decoupling is a term very glibly used. Decoupling from China basically means deglobalization. It means dismantling. You can't shift it all to India and Vietnam. So I don't think decoupling is going to happen, but I do think there's going to be massive competition for China to indigenize the spare parts it doesn't have to become a semiconductor leader. And for the West, plus partners like India, to come up with an alternative to Huawei, to name two of the sort of more immediate term challenges.
Such a pity that such engaging conversations must come to an end. Edward Luce just gave us a report card on the first 7 weeks of the Biden administration that looked quite decent. That democratic backsliding in the US has been checked somewhat is a matter of considerable satisfaction and not a little envy. Though, of course, as you said, it's a little early to say how enduring that will be. And you gave us many reasons to worry about the fragility of this democratic rebound and the resilience of populism. On behalf of the New India Foundation, it's an absolute pleasure to thank Edward Luce for delivering a superb and superbly fitting lecture in memory of the legendary Girish Karnad, followed by a phenomenally wide-ranging discussion with Manish Sabarwal and the audience. We are grateful to D. Ravichander and the Bangalore International Center for co-hosting this event. This is not the first time that the BIC has partnered with the NIF, and we look forward to a continuing and mutually enriching partnership with the Bangalore International Center. And finally, it remains for me to thank Smriti Khanna Mehra and Himali Sodhi for the incredibly hard work that they put into advance publicity for this event. Thank you again, Edward Luce, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.